It was a chilly morning in November 1326. The town square in Hereford wasn't filled with market stalls or traders, but with people eager to see something shocking. Nobles, priests, and everyday folks stood packed tightly together, waiting to witness a moment they would never forget. Up on a wooden stage, a thin, tired-looking man was dragged in front of them. Not long ago, he had been one of the most powerful people in all of England. The king had trusted him, and the royal court feared him. But now he was nothing more than a hated figure, known for betrayal, corruption, and a secret relationship no one dared to speak of. His name was Hugh Despenser the Younger. In just a few moments, he would suffer one of the most violent and painful deaths in England's history. He would be castrated, his insides pulled out, and his body torn apart in front of a cheering crowd. But what did Hugh do to deserve such a cruel end? Was he just a greedy man who climbed his way to the top no matter the cost? Or was he seen as something even more dangerous? A man who was romantically involved with the king? This isn't just a story about power and punishment. It's a story about obsession, political games, scandal, and the terrible cost of ambition. To understand how Hugh Despenser rose so high and fell so hard, we need to go back in time to a kingdom under pressure. A king desperate for loyalty, and a royal court where even a whisper could get you killed. This is the rise and fall of the king's favorite. Hugh Despenser was born around the year 1286 into a noble family. His father, Hugh Despenser the Elder, was a respected lord who faithfully served King Edward I. His mother, Isabel de Beauchamp, also came from a powerful family. Her father was the Earl of Warwick. From the very start, Hugh had power and influence running through his veins. He grew up around people in high places, learning how to behave at court, how to fight in battle, and how to survive the tricky politics of the noble world. But Hugh didn't want to be just another rich noble. He was smart, strategic, and driven by a deep hunger, not just for wealth or titles, but for true power. His big chance came in 1307, when Edward II became king. Edward was very different from his father. While Edward I had been a strong, no-nonsense warrior king, Edward II was more emotional and had a clear fondness for certain men. His first favorite, Piers Gaveston, shocked the royal court with his bold attitude and the close relationship he had with the king. The nobles hated Gaveston. In 1312, they had enough and killed him. With Gaveston gone, there was a space to fill, and Hugh saw his moment. By 1316, he had earned Edward II's trust and was given the important role of royal chamberlain. That meant Hugh was with the king every day and had access to him all the time. In medieval times, this was no small thing. Whoever had the king's ear had real control over the kingdom. Hugh knew exactly how to use this position to his advantage. He married Eleanor de Clare, who was the king's niece, which connected him directly to the royal family. This marriage gave him massive land in Glamorgan, Wales. Year after year, Hugh's power grew, and so did his greed. Hugh didn't hide his hunger for more. He started grabbing land from others, sometimes through shady legal tricks, other times by outright bullying people. He even forced his own sister-in-law to give him valuable property. In 1321, angry nobles started a rebellion, and King Edward was forced to send Hugh into exile. Most people would have seen that as the end of their rise to power. But not Hugh. While he was in exile, he actually became a pirate. Yes, a real pirate attacking English ships like some kind of medieval gangster with a grudge. By 1322, Edward II had crushed the rebellion and brought Hugh back. But this time, Hugh didn't just return to royal favor, he came back with total control. Between 1322 and 1326, Hugh and his father weren't just advising the king. They were practically running the country. They took over control of land, money, the law, and even who could speak to the king. One writer at the time said it plainly: Hugh Despenser was basically King of England without the crown. Of course, the other nobles couldn't stand this, neither could Queen Isabella. Isabella of France, the wife of Edward II, had been pushed aside by Hugh's growing influence. Her money was taken away. Her personal staff was removed. Even worse, her children were taken from her and put under the care of Hugh's wife. This wasn't just a personal insult. It was open war. And soon, Isabella would find someone to fight with her. In 1325, Isabella was sent to France to help negotiate a peace deal for her husband. While she was there, she met Roger Mortimer, powerful noble, who had once escaped from the Tower of London and fled to Europe. Mortimer was clever, charming, and most importantly, he hated Hugh Despenser. Isabella and Mortimer fell in love and became allies. Together, they made a bold plan to overthrow the King of England and destroy the Despenser family once and for all. In September 1326, a small army made up of hired foreign soldiers landed in England. They didn't expect what happened next, but it turned out to be exactly what they needed. The English nobles quickly turned against King Edward II. Years of cruelty and power abuse by the Despensers had built up a deep hatred. Now, that anger exploded. Edward II, along with Hugh Despenser the Younger and his father, Hugh Despenser the Elder, panicked. They tried to run west, taking the royal treasury with them. But they didn't get very far. Hugh the Elder was caught in Bristol. His execution was fast and violent. He was hanged while still wearing his armor, then his body was beheaded and cut into 4 parts. Edward II and Hugh the Younger kept running, trying to hide in Wales, but they were found near Neath in November. Edward was captured and soon imprisoned. He would later be forced to step down from the throne and give the crown to his teenage son, the future Edward III. But for Hugh Despenser the Younger, there would be no prison, no chance to escape, and no mercy. He tried to kill himself before the trial by refusing to eat, hoping to die before facing what he knew was coming. But his body didn't give out in time. He stayed alive just long enough for the execution. On November 24, 1326, in the town of Hereford, Hugh Despenser the Younger faced his final moments. Watching closely were Queen Isabella, Roger Mortimer, and a massive crowd hungry for blood. He was officially charged with treason, robbery, corruption, controlling the king, and abusing his power. But the trial didn't matter much. The decision to execute him had already been made. It wasn't just about punishing him, it was meant to send a strong political message. What happened next would become known as one of the most horrifying executions in English history. This wasn't just about killing Hewitt, it was about making an example of him. It wasn't a quick or quiet death. It was meant to terrify, humiliate, and teach a lesson. The torture started early that cold November morning. Soldiers dragged Hugh through the town, while crowds screamed and cheered. He was tied to a tall ladder, so that even people far away in the market could see his pain. A crown made from stinging nettles was placed on his head, a cruel joke about his former power. Even wrote Bible verses about pride and sin all over his body. It was like a violent sermon delivered not with words, but with fire and flesh. Then came the real pain. A writer named Jean Froissart described what happened next. The executioners began by cutting off Hugh's private parts and throwing them into a fire right in front of him. This wasn't random. Many people believed Hugh had a romantic relationship with King Edward II. At that time, the church called such relationships sinful and believed they went against nature and God. So this act was meant as a punishment for that too. The nightmare didn't stop there. While Hugh was still awake, they slowly sliced open his stomach. His insides were pulled out and burned in the fire. The crowd didn't flinch instead, they cheered. Some people said the sound Hugh made didn't even sound human. It was a scream of unbearable pain. Only after this long torture did they hang him. But even that wasn't the end. His head was cut off, and his body was chopped into 4 parts. Each piece was sent to different parts of England to be displayed. His head was stuck on a pole at London's city gates. This was more than a punishment. It was a warning to everyone. Hugh's downfall wasn't just about getting rid of one man. It was seen as cleaning up the kingdom. The way they punished him, especially the public castration, was full of meaning. It wasn't only for his crimes. It was meant to erase and take revenge on what many believed was an unhealthy hold he had over the king. It shouted a message. This is what happens to those who break God's law, the country's law, and the natural order. And yet, even after all that horror, something strange happened years later that showed a bit of mercy. In December 1330, 4 years after his death, Hugh's wife, Eleanor de Clare, was given permission to collect what was left of his body. She was allowed to bury the few bones they could find at the family's land in Gloucestershire. All they had was his head, a thigh bone, and a few small pieces. A sad ending for a man who once had power almost equal to the king. But Hugh's story wasn't the end. The king he served, Edward II, faced a fate just as disturbing. After giving up his throne to his 14-year-old son, Edward II was locked up in Berkeley Castle. At first, they kept him alive, a humiliated king, kept away from the public. But it was too risky to let him live. In September 1327, less than a year after Hugh's execution, Edward II was murdered. The most well-known story told for generations was that his killers used a red-hot metal rod to kill him by pushing it into his backside. This left no visible wounds on his body, but the act was brutal and meant to send a message. It was a final, violent punishment tied to his supposed relationship with Hugh. Modern historians still argue over whether that story is actually true. Some think it might have been made up later to make someone look bad. Others believe it could be real, especially considering how focused everyone was on revenge back then. Either way, the meaning behind it stayed strong. What happened to Hugh and Edward wasn't just about punishing them, it was about changing the story of who held power, who abused it, and how they would be remembered afterward. And the most surprising part? People who brought Hugh down didn't stay in charge for long. Queen Isabella and Roger Mortimer, once seen as heroes, soon turned into the very kind of rulers they had fought against. Mortimer, who was basically controlling England through the young Edward III, acted arrogant and showed favoritism, just like the corruption he had promised to end. By the year 1330, Edward III, who was now 17 years old, had had enough. In a bold move, he took back control of the throne, had Mortimer arrested, and put him on trial for treason. Mortimer was executed by hanging, though he was spared the horrible torture that Hugh had gone through. Power had changed hands once again. And still, even after all these years, Hugh Despenser's story keeps shocking people. In a recent poll, he was voted as one of the biggest villains of the 1300s, and even ranked on lists of the worst people in British history. His life has been retold in books, plays, and TV dramas, usually showing him as the ultimate schemer at court, greedy, ruthless, and dangerously charming. But there's more to this story. For a long time, the hate aimed at Hugh and Edward was shaped by strong religious beliefs and deep-rooted homophobia. Back then, accusing someone of sodomy wasn't just about private matters, it was a way to ruin them publicly. In the Middle Ages, calling someone morally corrupt usually meant attacking their closest personal relationships. Today's historians try to look at things more fairly. While it's clear Hugh was power-hungry and manipulative, the exact nature of his relationship with Edward is still unclear. Were they lovers? Was it a deep friendship? Or something in between? We'll probably never know for sure. What we do know is that whatever kind of relationship they had, their enemies used it against them. Their fall from power, and the violence of it, shows just how much fear and control were tied to ideas about sexuality and morality in medieval England. And this leads us to a bigger question. What does justice really mean? Hugh's death wasn't just a punishment, it was a public performance. His body was used to send a message. His execution was carefully planned to look like justice, but it was really about wiping the slate clean for the kingdom. It's easy to think people back then were more brutal than we are now. But are we really that different? Even today, when someone powerful falls from grace, just punishing them doesn't always feel like enough. We want to see it. We want the headlines, the shame, the spectacle. The tools may have changed, but our instincts haven't. The story of Hugh Despenser, with all its horror and tragedy, is more than just a tale of medieval cruelty. It's a powerful warning about what happens when power, desire, and politics crash into each other. Hugh wasn't born evil. Yes, he was born into a rich and noble family, but he also had huge pressure on him to succeed, to climb the ranks. To prove himself in a world where having a title meant everything, but safety meant nothing. Maybe in another life, Hugh could have been remembered as just another nobleman, loyal to the king. But he didn't stop there. He rose quickly, boldly, and without shame. He used everything he had: his marriage into royalty, his close bond with the king, his control of the law, and his hunger for land and money. And it worked, till it all fell apart. The same connection with King Edward II that lifted him up was the very thing that destroyed him in the end. And that's the part of his story that still echoes today. Hugh wasn't just hated for grabbing power or being corrupt. His enemies believed he had messed with the natural order politically, morally, and sexually. In the strict, male-dominated religious society of 14th century England, where the church and nobility set the rules, Someone like Hugh, seen as using charm, sex, and favoritism to gain power, was more than just annoying. He was a real threat to the system. His brutal execution made sure everyone got the message. It wasn't about following the LUT, it was about cleaning house, getting rid of what was seen as rot right in front of the public. Fire and rope were their tools for a moral purge. But the fear behind it all wasn't just about Hugh himself. It was about what he represented. The idea that someone outside the traditional rules, someone who didn't play by society's expectations, could rise to such heights through emotional or physical closeness to the king, terrified the people in charge. It made the entire social order feel unstable. And that was something medieval England couldn't tolerate. So they made Hugh into an example, the ultimate example. But like so many things in history, the story didn't end there. The people who took Hugh down, Isabella and Mortimer, didn't stay in power for long. Just 4 years later, their rule fell apart. The young Edward III, who had likely been watching everything closely and learning fast, took control for himself. He had Mortimer executed and quietly removed his mother, Queen Isabella, from power. She was never put on trial or punished, but she lost her influence. Edward had learned a hard truth. Never let anyone else rule for you. Don't let a favorite, a lover, or a regent take your place as king. The irony is hard to ignore. Hugh had gained power by stepping in when a weak king left a gap. Mortimer did the same, and both of them paid the price. Almost 700 years later, people still talk about Hugh Despenser, not because of anything noble or brave he did, but because of how badly and dramatically he fell. His end became a symbol, a warning, a chilling example burned into history. Still today, his legacy feels more complicated. Modern historians are rethinking how we see Hugh. Yes, he was greedy, manipulative, and corrupt, but now some ask whether the hatred toward him was made worse by politics. Religious fear and prejudice against his sexuality. In medieval Europe, accusing someone of sodomy was a common way to ruin them. You didn't need evidence, just people ready to believe the worst. Once that kind of rumor started, it quickly turned deadly. So maybe Hugh's story isn't just about how power can corrupt. It's also about how dangerous power becomes when it's tied to identity, when things like love, sex, or taboo are involved. Not because of what those things are, but because of what others are afraid they might mean. In Hugh's case, his power seemed to challenge the usual order. He upset the expectations of gender, his royal authority, and what it meant to be a man. And for that, his punishment had to be dramatic, symbolic, and impossible to forget. Even now, when he appears in movies or books, Hugh is often shown not just as a villain, but as a seducer or the secret ruler behind the throne, the man whispering into Edward's ear. What's interesting and kind of revealing is that people don't remember him most for his political actions or cruelty, but for how close he was to the king's heart. That's what makes his story both gripping and disturbing. It doesn't just show us the past, it reflects something back at us today. Because if you take away the medieval clothes, the executions, and the swords, what's left is deeply human. A man who craved power, a king who longed for love, a court that demanded order, and a society desperate to find someone to blame. When all of that came together, it didn't just take down a man, it created a legend. A dark, haunting legend soaked in fear and violence. So the next time we see someone being publicly destroyed on television, on the internet, or in the public eye, we should think about Hugh Despenser. Not to excuse what he did, but to understand the system that tears people down when they fall out of favor. Because history doesn't just repeat, it puts on a show, and we, the viewers, are still standing in the square only now. The stage is online, and the executions happen in the headlines. Hugh Despenser's broken body was scattered to the winds, but his story didn't vanish. It's not remembered as a lesson in justice or as a tale of moral victory. It survives as a warning about power, about being too close to the people who have it, and about how, whether in medieval times or today, there's always a cost when you reach too close to the throne.